So today we're going to further develop our landscape paintings by working on the foreground. Now, because the objects in the foreground are closer to the viewer and because of atmospheric perspective, we're going to focus a lot more on details today than we have the past couple of sessions of painting. That's not to say that we're going to jump right into details just yet. We still have a good amount of just blocking in colors to go through, just like we've done with the background and the middle ground. Just big shapes blocking in some chunks, and then we can start developing those details. We've got to have those big basic things first before we can start getting down to those smaller things. So what I'm going to be working on today is the reflections in the water, those little water ripples, the reflections of the trees and the clouds, and then the greenery off to the left side of the image. Notice how the ripples tend to move in a single direction, so when you're painting on the surface of the water, try to keep your brush moving from side to side the same way that the water does. So now that I have got the water started, I'm going to let that layer dry for just a little bit, and I'm going to start blocking in some of the colors of the trees off to the left side of the image. There's a lot of different greens, yellows going on in those branches, so I'm just going to start with a basic green. And just like we've been doing with every other part of our painting, just blocking in that color, it's just going to be on a much larger scale. So make sure that you're using a big brush. The area I'm working on right now is very dense with leaves, so I'm not worrying too much about accidentally covering up the background here, so I'm being pretty sloppy with how I'm painting. But notice that I'm trying to move in the general direction that the leaves are moving in. As you get into those tighter, smaller spaces, that's when you want to be more careful with your paintbrush, how much paint you're using. I'm kind of just fluffing out the paint here, trying to create that leaf-like movement. And remember to look at your image. If you see a color change, you see a different chunk of color, go ahead and apply that to your painting. I'm noticing that the branches seem to be alternating between light green and dark green because of those shadows and highlights. So I'm just going to put a little bit of this lighter green in here. And then of course more shadows and highlights will come in later layers. Again, as I'm getting into these tighter branch areas, I'm not even really moving the paintbrush in strokes. I'm kind of using little taps along the edges of the branches to kind of give that more leaf-like effect. I find that also if you just tap a little bit on the canvas, that's all you really need to do to create the illusion that there are leaves there. Of course, as you're doing this, remember to put more paint on your brush often. If it gets too dry, it's going to be too transparent, and then you're going to have to just make more work for yourself. So keep reloading your brush. It's also important to keep in mind that you can still see some of the sky through your leaves, especially if you have these sort of thinner branches. So don't just paint a big blob if you have a branch that's like this. Just do little taps, little small pats of paint. Leave some of the sky behind it. You can go back later and try to repaint some of the sky through the branches, but it's good to just take precautions, just do little small amounts of paint. Make them pretty sparse and far apart. So here I'm starting work on the reflections of the background trees that you can see in the water. Now these are just a reflection of the trees in the background. These trees aren't actually physically closer to us, so you're not going to necessarily add more detail here than you did in the background. I'm just going to start out by just blocking in the basic shapes. The reflection comes straight down. It's like looking into a mirror pretty much. So whatever you see on one side, try to just make it symmetrical on the bottom, like a flipped image. Since I have this green, I'm just going to lay it down over here wherever I see it. Again, if you have a paint color that you can use in more than one spot, take that opportunity. I'm gonna also work on this rock. It's probably hard for you guys to see it in the small little image that I have attached, but there is a little red rock off to the side of the river. So I'm just gonna do some color matching, trying my best to mix colors and recreate the one that I see. Remember, you can paint from dark to light or light to dark, whichever works best for you. But I'm just blocking in the colors that are in the image. Okay, so just pushing on with those details, working on the water reflection a little bit more. Again, think about keeping that brush moving from side to side, like the ripples in the water do. That will give you a more realistic looking reflection. And again, using that green that I made in other places, taking that opportunity. And if you have a lot of greenery, you're going to have a lot of different greens going on. You don't want to be too monotonous with the same green or the same tints and shades of green. Try to throw some more yellows in there, little bits of red, different blues. Just play around. Try your best to recreate the colors that you see. There's going to be a lot of different colors involved in creating the ones that you see in the natural world. You might notice that your water, it has little white stripes at the peaks of the water ripples. So just adding a few of those, especially around the riverbank, around greenery, can add that extra little bit of realism to your painting. I'd also recommend having a slightly wetter brush when you're adding these little stripes across the water. Okay, so now I'm going to move into what's called the dry brush technique. This is good for adding greenery details like little leaves, adding things to bushes. So I'm using an older brush. It's a square brush, and the bristles are much harder than the ones that we've been working with up until this point. So once you've dipped your brush into the paint, you're going to just pat it onto the surface. Just tapping, and you want to kind of rotate your fingers a little bit while you're doing this so that it's not just creating the same pattern over and over again, which tends to look unrealistic. If you kind of move your hand here and there, kind of turning the brush in your fingers, you'll get a more realistic, irregular leaf pattern. And while I'm doing this, my palette's gonna get kind of crazy looking. I'm gonna have a few different greens going at the same time. One that's more yellow, one that's more blue, one that's got a little bit more red in it. And we've reached a point here in our painting where, since you're using this brush, you actually don't need to wash it off and dry it off after every color. If you just kind of wipe off the paint that you're using on your paper towel to go switch to another color, that's all you really need to do. The brush is so dry and the bristles are so hard that that's actually okay to just go in there and keep dry brushing. If you get the brush wet, it might mess up the effect just a little bit. So again, I'm just looking at what colors I see in the trees and just trying to place those colors where I see them. So wherever I see a lighter green, I'm going to put down my lighter color. And then I'm going in there and adding a bit more detail to the edges of the branches, just rotating that brush again, trying to create that leaf-like texture. Some of my branches are going to start looking pretty thick at this point. I will be going back later on and adding in a bit of sky in between some of the leaves, only because some of these branches are more thick than I intend them to be. So I will be going back and adding those details later. But for right now, I'm just worrying about getting that branch shape. If your leaves are looking more blobby than you'd like them to, after you put more paint on your brush, tap off the extra paint on the paper towel before you put it on the canvas, and that will give you a better dry brush effect. Another tip, something that I would like to go back and work on again in this painting is to try to make your leaves darker than you think they should be. It's easy to get caught up in thinking that, oh, leaves are green. You know, there are a few different shades and tints of green. But for the most part, when they're against a big, bright sky, they're going to be a lot more shadowy than you think they are. So here I'm just going in here again, adding in a few more colors wherever I see them. In leaves especially, really look for the few dead leaves here and there. Add in a few orange leaves, a few red leaves if you see them. And remember to work all the way up to the very edge of the image. It's easy to get into the habit of doing a lot of work in the middle of the canvas and kind of neglecting the sides a bit. Really make sure that you push those details all the way up to the edge of the canvas. Now, when you're doing the reflection of clouds, sometimes they take on a different shape than how you see them in the sky. So, really look at the picture that you have of your landscape. Really pay close attention to the shape of the clouds that are being reflected in the water. They might seem a lot longer than they do in the sky. So as far as roughing out our foreground area, we're pretty much done here for today. Of course, there's more details that we need to add in the next session, but for right now, this is about as far as I'm going to go for today. So as always, ladies, remember to clean your brushes out thoroughly, make sure you clean your water cup, and if you need to take this home to finish fleshing out your background, middle ground, and foreground, you can do so. Just make sure that you sign out a brush.